Charles didn't know that Tina, Tommy, and Hugh had killed the freed demons, nor did he need to know. He had already set some of the demons free in front of the others, and had given his team the order not to hunt them down. As far as he was concerned, his work was done. According to the contract between species, he had done all he had needed to do. Whether those giant demons were alive or dead was irrelevant. After helping the Cerberus pack reclaim the territory, Charles began to survey the area. Because of the strength of Bullet's purple Nightmare Horse bloodline, he had tamed more than 500 Nightmare Horses. And after the horse's next mating season, that number would increase significantly. The Nightmare Horse's growth cycle was 2 years, and it could reach level 5 in that time. If Charles needed more powerful mounts after they had fully grown, he could push some of the horses to level 6 by giving them more food. However, he couldn't wait 2 years to expand his cavalry's power, so he continued to tame more Nightmare Horses. Apart from the Nightmare Horses, many of the other herbivores in the area had already been tamed or eaten by other species, causing Charles's plans for the horses to draw some ire from the Cerberus pack. "Come on now," Charles said to the Cerberus. "Surely you know how to find some food elsewhere." The Cerberus let out a tiny puff of flame in the hellhound equivalent of a sigh.
"In the past, our food was delivered to our doorstep," it said. "We never needed to find it for ourselves."
Under the reign of the Cerberus pack, the weaker species had brought food to the Cerberuses in hopes that they wouldn't be eaten themselves. The only enemies the pack had faced had been those from the outside world. Charles was taken aback by the Cerberus' answer. The Cerberuses really were in a miserable state compared to their former glory when I found them, he thought. They had never even had to hunt before they were cursed, but they were practically starving to death. However, he quickly dismissed the thought, knowing that it wasn't the time to get bogged down with pity. There was no justice or sin in nature. There was only the hunter and the hunted. Whether in hell or the mortal world, weakness was practically a death sentence. In the battles against the tribes, the ordinary knights had only gained battle experience, while Charles had gained a tremendous amount of power and resources. Although the Hellhounds had eaten many of the fallen enemies, Charles had already extracted the soul energy from their bodies. He had even collected some of the more powerful ones in his energy storage space. Because the demons they had slain had been so powerful, the sheer amount of soul energy Charles had absorbed from them had increased the size of both his energy storage space and the spring of essence water within it. During the reorganization of the tribes, Charles sent a few people to ask the Minotaurs where they had gotten their weapons from, but all the creatures said was that the weapons had been mined from the magic iron vein. After receiving this information, Charles went to the nearby magic iron mine. There, he found that magic iron was a metal of the same strength as dark iron. Knowing he hadn't yet secured a source of powerful crafting materials in Hell, he gave the order to mine large amounts of the iron. Meanwhile, he took 2 massive chunks of the iron and put them in his energy storage space for the Dark Dwarves to process. Although he already had enough dark iron for his needs, he knew that if he wanted to do some research, or even more important things in the future, his supply might not be enough. He left the remaining mining work to the Demon and Minotaur tribes, but he found that after he had given his orders, they had quickly handed the job over to the goblins, who were at the bottom of Hell's pecking order. Either way, Charles didn't care who worked in the mines, he only wanted results. Once the creatures had mined enough magic iron, he would travel back to Hell alone to collect it. It was impractical to summon the entire army to help him, but the trip wouldn't be too much trouble for him. As he was doling out his orders and examining the area, Charles found something strange. Since the owner of the mysterious ancient book had raised the Dark Dwarves in the territory, Charles realized that they likely had forged a lot of refined equipment there in the past. If that's the case, then why are the giant demons' and Minotaurs' weapons so crude? He wondered. They're mostly just sloppily flattened pieces of metal and flimsy wooden staves. Where did all the dwarves' weapons disappear to? But then, he remembered the Cerberus had said that before the old master had mysteriously disappeared, he had taken an army with him, including high-quality equipment for them. The weaker giant demons must not have been strong enough for the old master to give them weapons from the Dark Dwarves, he thought. If that's the case, how powerful was the army of creatures he took with him, and how did they all go missing? Charles knew that if the old master had left to carry out a decisive battle, then the battle had surely left behind an indelible mark. When Charles explored the area enough, he was bound to find the remnants of the battle. After spending a day to count the spoils of war, Charles gathered 300 giant demons, 500 minotaurs, 1,000 blade demons, and 200 shadow demons to use as cannon fodder. The main purpose of the new cannon fodder unit was to reduce human casualties in battle. After the unit was assembled, Charles brought the demons along to continue their journey. He had gone to Hell not just to take over some land, but also to train his soldiers in the heat of an intense and bloody battle. And given the increase in his team's strength and skill, he felt his mission had succeeded. But they weren't done just yet. The Cerberus was also eager to fight again. After all, it had just reached level 8, and it couldn't wait to test out its newfound power and push it to its limits. So after resting for just a day, Charles's team set off again. The Knights of Hell split into 4 groups, unceasingly slaughtering the enemies they ran into along the way. No matter what kind of creatures they were, if they moved, the Knights cut them down. Charles led the cannon fodder unit himself. When the Knights encountered any powerful enemies, he sent the unit to the front lines to try to reduce the human casualties as much as possible. After a day of fighting, they had wiped out 3 ghoul species. The ghouls had no intelligence and couldn't be recruited like the demons and other creatures. They weren't even fit to be food for the Cerberuses, so Charles gathered their bodies into the energy storage space and used them as fertilizer for his crops. During that time, Charles's team had also destroyed some other tribes and had tamed a large number of herbivores, increasing their number of mounts significantly. Just as the group set off to pick another fight, Charles received a message from the human world. As Dawn City's head of security, Lena found herself sorting out troubles of all sorts, day in and day out. At that moment, she was busy questioning a man and woman who were caught up in a dispute. "Let me get this straight," she said, pointing at the woman. "You sold him some goods, and then you changed the price?" She had learned that not all matters were black and white, and so she was willing to hear the woman out, but she could already feel a headache coming on. "It's not as simple as that," said the woman, whose name was Maya. "Oh, come on," said the man. "It's exactly as simple as that. We agreed on a price, and then when I came to collect this morning, you hiked the cost up. Do you think I'm made of money?" "What do you mean we agreed on a price?" Maya snapped back. "We didn't agree on anything." They quickly descended into bickering. Their arguments summed up Lena's experience of running security in Dawn City. Across the city, people had turned to crime in order to put food on the table. Although at first she had found such behavior despicable, she had come to accept that not everybody had a powerful brother like Charles to support them. Many of her fellow Dawnians were simply helpless, and she couldn't judge them too harshly for the depths to which they stooped in order to survive. Olivia had initially suggested that they maintain a hardline approach to criminals, even proposing that they execute anyone who stepped out of line. Her argument had been that although in peacetime they might have the luxury of treating criminals with forgiveness and understanding, during periods of war and general unrest, it was vital to make a merciless example of criminals, so that nobody else was tempted to follow their example. However, Lena couldn't find it in herself to be so heartless. Besides, the 2 people in front of her were only arguing over a price dispute. She hardly thought they deserved to be executed for that. A few security personnel stood at her side. "These guys clearly have too much time on their hands, so they're just looking for trouble," said one of them. "They say the devil makes work for idle hands. I say we send them to the ore mine and keep them occupied there." Since the apocalypse had begun, there had been no telling what behavior people were capable of in a pinch, and the crime and corruption throughout the city had certainly kept Lena's security team busy. As far as she was concerned, it was a waste of time and their scant resources to spend too long worrying about such small-time crooks as the 2 that stood before her. "Isn't it your job to upkeep justice?" Maya asked. "You want justice?" Lena asked. "Elsewhere in the city, people are being subjected to far worse than a simple disagreement about money." Maya didn't respond, realizing that if she took things further, it might mean the closure of whatever racket she was running. The man sighed with relief. "If I'd known you were going to be so unreasonable, I would have never done business with you," he said. "Who are you calling unreasonable?" she asked. "I need to eat too, you know." She began to sob, but Lena didn't waver. Although Lena had often been moved by displays of grief and suffering in the past, she had seen it so often that she had grown accustomed to it. The simple fact of the matter was that life had become tough all over. Although she understood that people might need to break the law to make ends meet, that didn't mean that she needed to take pity on them. After all, there were many others who risked their lives by going outside the city to scavenge for resources, rather than taking advantage of other civilians. She looked from one to the other, and something occurred to her. She had a strange sense that there was something off about their argument. It was only a hunch, but it was a strong hunch. She watched them quarrel and was sure that she caught a certain distracted look in their eyes that gave her pause. These people aren't all they seem, she said to her soldiers. We need to make them talk. The two were good actors, but she had seen through their ruse all the same. Her staff quickly obeyed her order, advancing on the pair. When the two saw the security officers approaching, they panicked. Don't hurt us, said Maya. We'll tell you everything. We didn't do it on purpose, said the man. Let us explain. They explained that someone had convinced them to cause trouble in that part of the city, paying them in crystal cores. It had helped that they were already familiar with the criminal underworld, so their act wasn't much of a departure from their actual lives. However, Lena had seen through their deception and thrown a wrench in their plans. Take them out of here, she ordered. Then go and see what else you can find out. As some of her officers took them away, Lena led the rest of her team back to the inner city. When they reached the wall, they found a crowd surrounding the main gate, brandishing banners and protesting. Their faces were red with anger as they chanted and yelled, Let us in there! What right do you have to keep us out of the inner city? This is class warfare! We won't listen to your rules! Dawn City was divided between the inner and outer city. The inner city was Charles's original base, and the home of his core group of followers. Meanwhile, the outer part was populated by the great many people who had realized that staying as close to Charles and his people as possible presented their best chance of safety. However, the outer area was much more rundown and dangerous than the inner, and the disparity between the two had caused a great deal of resentment and strife. Meanwhile, some people were shouting from the other side of the gate. We earned our place in here, someone cried. We fought for it with our lives. What have you done to earn it? Yeah, you don't even dare to go out and kill zombies, shouted another. What right do you have to come in here? Such class warfare had led to a great many internal conflicts throughout the various survival bases. All things considered, Dawn City was thought of as the fairest of them, where it was clear that anyone could access the inner city if they were prepared to hunt zombies. People were even given weapons to assist them in their scavenging missions. However, there were many in the outer city who suspected that some of them were being used as bait for the more fortunate, giving them an easier time attracting and killing zombies. They weren't entirely wrong, as such practices weren't unheard of. Although Dawn City had prohibited such tactics, it had been impossible to stamp it out altogether. And so, for all sorts of reasons, there persisted a significant amount of discord and distrust between the two parts of the city. Lena surveyed the crowd and took a deep breath as she tried to focus herself. In the past, she had sympathized with the people in the outer city, and she had even visited them a few times to hand out food. However, she had soon found that if she gave food to one person or family, it wouldn't be long before others would come seeking the same. And before long, she would be surrounded by a crowd that she felt powerless to help. It was only later that she had learned from Olivia that the higher-ups in Dawn City had been relying on the charity of the more fortunate city dwellers to keep the peace in the outer city. If the Good Samaritans in the city helped those in need on their own accord, the poor could be helped without those in power needing to take direct action. It made Lena uneasy to think that Charles and his cohorts were comfortable to exploit the good intentions of the virtuous. She was made even more uneasy to learn that some of the generous donors had been killed in the act of providing such charity, especially when the crowd had decided that they hadn't distributed things fairly. Olivia had promised to bring justice to the murderers, although that brand of justice hardly helped put Lena's mind at ease. In fact, there had been many occasions when Olivia had shown that she was capable of making tough political decisions that Lena would have shied away from. It had helped her to gain a devoted following in the city. Lena was eager to find her own way of inspiring loyalty. She approached the crowd, and the people made way. They were excited to see that a figure of authority had arrived, and they expected that their sheer force of numbers would convince her to allow them access to the inner city. Finally, someone's here, one of them said. Let us in. Why should those people in there live a good life while we're left out here to starve? Asked another. All we're asking is to be treated the same, said a third. Lena listened to them thoughtfully and only spoke when their voices had died down. I hear you, she said. If you really want to be treated the same as the people in there, then we can certainly arrange that. The crowd perked up at her words. They were heartened to learn that it had helped to have numbers on their side. With such a crowd behind them, they were confident that any of their requests would be granted. Meanwhile, those in the inner city were disappointed. They believed that they had earned the special right to live in the inner city. They had put their lives on the line for it. They were outraged that Lena was even thinking of giving the same benefits to the other people, apparently for free. It was true that some of them pitied the tough lives of the people of the outer city, but they still couldn't accept that those people were being given the benefits of the inner city at no cost. "Then what are you waiting for?" asked one of the outer city people. "Let us in." "Yeah, open the gate and let us in," chimed in another. Lena turned to her soldiers. "Rifles at the ready," she said. Then she addressed the crowd. "Anyone who dares to make any trouble will be shot." To reinforce her point, the guards aimed their guns at the crowd, and the outer city people immediately quieted down. Still, there were still some vague mutterings. Lena used her wind power to disperse those final murmuring voices. "In order to access the inner city, you'll all need to find work," she announced, her voice booming in the silence. "There are many jobs to choose from in there, from working in the factories to joining the super squad. Anyone who wants to work in one of the factories must have 3 recommendations from members of the super squad, and each super squad member can only recommend 1 person." She stood tall as she scanned the crowd. "Since you all want to come in, you have to accept the rules of the city," she continued. "You'll be split into groups of 4. 1 person will join the factories, while the other 3 will enter the super squad. You can discuss among yourselves who goes where. After you've made your decision, find the person in charge and register your decision." The crowd burst once again into uproar. "What do you mean we have to join the super squad? That's dangerous!" "We want to work in the factory, not the super squad." "You can't make us fight those zombies." They couldn't accept that most of them would have to join the super squad. After all, the reason that they were requesting access to the inner city in the first place was to find a safe place to live, not to be forced outside of the city completely and defend themselves against zombies. However, as far as Lena was concerned, although they made some reasonable points, it didn't change the fact that they would somehow need to pay for their access to the inner city. Before she could respond, though, some people at the front of the crowd pushed forward, and the guards fired at them. The shots weren't intended to kill, only to sufficiently injure the people at the front, so that nobody would think about leading a full-on charge. "They got my leg!" cried one of them. "Someone help me up!" "Keep this up and we'll block the door!" shouted another. "We don't care if you shoot at us. If we can't come in, then you can't come out." "Move aside," boomed a voice from behind Lena. "Anyone who gets in the way will be killed without hesitation." She recognized the voice at once. "Kevin?" Lena asked, her eyes lighting up. She whipped around to find him marching toward them with 50 or so of his followers. The people in the crowd weren't quite as happy to see Kevin's arrival. They glared at him and his retinue. "Just who do you think you are?" asked one of them. "You can't simply kill them," said Kevin coldly. His followers unsheathed their longswords and attacked the crowd with a formidable sword energy. In the blink of an eye, the ground was strewn with corpses. The survivors were paralyzed with shock. They hadn't expected that their unrest might lead to such bloody punishment without so much as a warning. Kevin advanced to the city wall before turning and addressing the crowd. "An enemy has infiltrated Dawn City," he said. "From now on, the city will be in a state of martial law. We'll execute anyone who causes the slightest trouble just as easily as we dealt with your friends here." To prove his point, his followers lunged at a few other members of the crowd, killing them in a few short strokes. Many tried to break free of the gathering, scattering and sprinting for safety. The rest stayed where they were, looking meekly at the ground. Lena approached Kevin. "What's going on?" she asked. "This group didn't just decide to turn up today of their own accord," Kevin said. "Someone organized them." He turned to his soldiers. "We need to find out who. If people are unwilling to talk, kill them. If any of them escape, I'll hold you personally responsible." He took Lena's arm and led her away, with some of their soldiers following behind. "What's going on?" she asked again as they hurried off. "There's no time to explain," said Kevin. "But all of today's trouble has been orchestrated by someone yet to reveal themselves." Before he could say any more, an explosion boomed out from the direction of the mayor's mansion. "We have to get there before it's too late," Kevin muttered, and he broke into a run. Lena was confused. She had thought she had been dealing with the situation well enough, but it seemed that she had simply fallen into the trap of someone who was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Whoever had organized the troublemakers had been trying to stall for time, and that's exactly what she had given them. The strongest Knights of Hell had left with Charles, and she was keenly aware that if anyone had decided to attack Dawn City, she and Kevin would have a hard time defending it. She took her bow from her back and notched an arrow, preparing for whatever was to come. In Charles's absence, it was up to her to protect the city. Before they could reach the mayor's mansion, they ran into a group of around 20 figures of white robes. "Don't stand against us," said the leader, who wore a cross around his neck that indicated he was a member of the Cross Church group. "When our matters are concluded, we promise to leave here in an orderly fashion. We won't cause you trouble, but if you insist on getting in the way of our plans, you'll only have yourselves to blame for the consequences." "Who are you?" Kevin asked. "Who we are is none of the other man started to say, but he paused when Kevin drew his sword. In unison, Kevin's soldiers used their sword energy to summon scarlet blades in their own hands. "A few mere warriors such as yourselves think you can stand up against my paranormals?" asked the leader, as his followers summoned shields of holy light. It was clear that Kevin's soldiers were at a disadvantage against the paranormals, even though they were at a high level of cultivation. In order to stand any chance against them, they would need to avoid their enemies' attacks and find their weak points. It wouldn't be a fair fight, but they'd accepted long ago that there was very little in the world that was fair anymore. Kevin's soldiers charged at the robed figures. "Watch out!" cried Lena. "They're all light-powered and at level 5. But when the soldiers' swords struck the holy light the church members had summoned, the light seemed to melt away. The leader of the group was stunned. "What kind of power is this?" he asked. He had never before come across a warrior without superpowers who was able to use sword energy to melt his light-powered defenses. But he didn't have time to reflect any further. Kevin had arrived at his side as though appearing out of thin air. He held his sword aloft, and it bloomed with energy. The robed figures were baffled. "Impossible!" cried one. "What kind of ability is this?" asked another. "Are you kidding me?" gasped a third. They tried their best to resist, but their efforts were useless. When their attacks landed on Kevin, they hardly left a scratch. It was as though their holy light was nothing but a cheap magic trick. Meanwhile, Kevin and his soldiers cut down several of the robed figures with ease. Lena watched in a daze. She had known that Kevin was the strongest of the martial artists, but she was still amazed by his power. Kevin met her gaze. For an instant, she felt a deep connection between them, and she heard her heart thudding in her ears. He smiled at her. "Help me out here, will you?" he asked. She nodded, realizing that it was no time to become sentimental, and she rushed in to join the fight. Olivia hurried through the halls of the mayor's mansion, clutching Jenny close to her side and shielding the girl's eyes so that she wouldn't see the corpses of Donnie and guards littering the floor. Each had been killed with a single knife slit across the throat. They showed no signs of having had a chance to resist. "Don't look, Jenny," Olivia whispered. A man stepped out from behind a corner, blocking the way. He held a silver cross. A group of paranormals followed him, all in white robes. "Hand over the girl, and we'll leave the city now," their leader said. "Otherwise, we'll burn this place to the ground. Think about your next move carefully. This is your home. I don't think you want us to reduce it to ruins." "Ruins?" said Olivia, scoffing. "And how are you going to manage that?" She bent her head down. "Be good," she whispered into Jenny's ear as she picked her up. "Keep your eyes closed." She turned from the man, ducking away and making for a different hallway out of the mansion. Then the paranormals lunged at her. "Be careful with her," the leader said, but his warning was too late. The paranormals swept their holy light swords at Olivia's body. It seemed inevitable that they would meet their target, but they passed through her as if through thin air and hit the wall instead. Olivia wasn't harmed in the slightest. In fact, she was already halfway down the hall, out of harm's way for the time being. The paranormals were left dumbfounded by her escape. "You have to stop her!" shouted the leader of the paranormals as Olivia ran away with Jenny in her arms. His followers caught up with Olivia, but she dodged their next attack, defying all expectations by disappearing and reappearing some distance away. Then she sprinted off, holding Jenny tight. The paranormals left the mansion to follow her, but stopped when a harsh and stinging rain began to fall. They cried out in surprise. "It's so cold! This must be another attack!" They were almost frozen where they stood. They tried their best to chase after Olivia, but by that point, she was far away. Alice found Olivia in the chaos. She breathed a sigh of relief when she saw Jenny in her arms. "Take Jenny as far as you can go," she said. They didn't know where the enemy paranormals had come from, but it was clear that they had deliberately taken advantage of the city when Charles and his knights weren't there. They had heard scattered news that there was a ruckus at the main gate, and that Kevin and Lena had gone to deal with a crowd that had assembled there. The enemy paranormals caught up with them. "Stay back," Olivia warned, and then she ran off with Jenny in her arms. Alice used her freezing blast attack, shooting a stream of icy water at the paranormals. Even after reaching level 5, it was crucial for her to keep building her strength. There were many ways to do that, the most effective of which was to use close combat to develop her speed and strength, the two attributes that form the foundation of the rest of her abilities. Olivia's blink ability, which she had used in her escape much to the paranormal's bewilderment, allowed her to create the illusion that her body was in one place when it was actually in another. That was why the paranormal's attacks had passed through her in the mayor's mansion. Alice, meanwhile, specialized in water control. The controls she was required to wield over the Gate of Hell meant that she possessed an incredible degree of general focus, lending a great deal of power to her water abilities. Her water attacks were made even stronger thanks to the bead that Charles had given her. As a result, her freezing blast attack left the paranormal stunned and trembling. By the time they had recovered, she had disappeared. It hadn't been her intention to kill them, but simply to buy herself some time. Once she was a good distance away, she summoned her nightmare horse and chased after Olivia, who'd been too scattered to think of summoning her own horse, and so had carried on foot. "There she is!" shouted a paranormal, leading about 80 of his teammates to Olivia, who was almost at the city well. Once again, she used her blink ability to bring herself and Jenny to the door in an instant. At that point, though, the entry was blocked by the crowd of outer city people demanding that their rights and interests be recognized. "Let us in!" one of them cried. "We want to join the inner city!" Olivia hugged Jenny tight to her and rushed into the throng. People muttered and called out as she shoved past. "Who does she think she is? Doesn't she have any manners?" Some robed figures raised the silver crosses in their hands up high and shouted orders. "The Holy Maiden is among you!" cried one of them. "Kill all the adults here so we can find her!" A few hundred paranormals rushed forward and began to slaughter the crowd. People rushed over one after another, trying to escape the wave of paranormals carrying out the massacre. The paranormals all wore silver crosses around their necks. The city guards were dumbfounded. Some threatened the paranormals with machine guns. "Stop now or we'll shoot!" one of them shouted. When the paranormals paid them no attention, they opened fire. Although they gunned down several of the enemies, it did nothing to waylay the onslaught. The paranormals didn't seem to care for either their own safety or that of their teammates, and simply carried on fighting. The soldiers were further hampered in their attempt to keep some kind of peace, because they needed to make sure not to shoot any civilians, so it was difficult to land many effective shots. Screams rose up from the crowd. "What are you doing? This is Dodge City, we're under protection! Don't kill me, I surrender!" Those who were screaming failed to elicit any sympathy from the murderers, who seemed completely devoid of emotion. Their expressions showed neither horror nor glee as they rampaged through the crowd. When Alice arrived, a chill went down her spine as she beheld the horrific scene. Although she had seen enough conflict over the past months to be able to keep her composure. Kevin and Lena hurried over with their soldiers. "What's happening?" asked Lena. Alice pointed to some of the robed figures in the crowd. "They want to kidnap Jenny," she said. "Olivia's trying to escape with her." Kevin peered into the crowd. "Hopefully she's used her blink ability and that's not really her," he said. "Quick, let's head to the ore mine." He and Lena summoned their nightmare horses and left. When the paranormals had finished killing everyone in the crowd, they approached a woman who looked just like Olivia, who had a spear sticking through her abdomen. In her arms was a cloth doll. As they approached, they realized that it wasn't Olivia and that they had been duped again. "Who are you?" one of the paranormals asked her. "Where is the Holy Maiden?" Another paranormal pointed away. "The Holy Maiden is in that direction," he said. "The gods have told me." "Who are those people?" Alice asked once she had caught up with Olivia. "The Cross Church group," Olivia answered. "I didn't expect them to come here. They seem to think Jenny is this Holy Maiden they keep going on about. I don't know what they're up to, but they must have been planning this for a while. They knew exactly the right time to strike." "I could tell that something was wrong, so I hurried back as soon as I could," said Kevin. "How'd you get away from the crowd?" asked Lena. "Did you know the Cross Church group would try to get Jenny?" "Charles said we needed to protect her," said Olivia. Naturally, I made some preparations. It didn't matter if there was an enemy or not. I knew I needed to prepare. They slowed when they reached some dilapidated buildings at the edge of the city. Lena felt a little out of her league in the company of Kevin and Alice. Although she was very powerful, she felt a bit intimidated by their obvious strength and mastery of their abilities. Suddenly, a group of around 2,000 robed figures arrived from all directions and quickly surrounded them. They stood in a ring around them with wild eyes. The group's leader stepped forward. "We have you surrounded," he said. "I'll give you a simple choice. Give us the Holy Maiden in your arms, and we'll leave you in peace. Otherwise, Dawn City will have made a powerful enemy in the Cross Church group." The group's search for Holy Maiden had caused a commotion long ago, although they had since fallen silent. It was generally believed that they had found what they had been looking for, but it seemed that their search had continued in secret. "We heard you already found your Holy Maiden," said Kevin. "So why'd you come back to our city to steal another of our children?" "The one we believed to be the Holy Maiden was a fake," said the leader. "The gods have granted me the power to see the truth. I will bring the true Holy Maiden back and expose the lies of the false one." Kevin found it strange that someone had been so bold as to pretend to be the Holy Maiden. Still, the man's ranting meant nothing to him. There was no way they would hand over Jenny. "If you want your Holy Maiden so badly, why didn't you talk to Charles while he was still here?" Olivia asked. "By any chance, was it because you knew he'd never agree?" The leader sighed. "I didn't mean to cause so much death," he said in a soft tone. "But you insisted on standing in our way, and we're prepared to do anything for our Holy Maiden." Jenny opened her eyes and looked around. "Are they trying to take me away?" she asked. "If you let them, will that stop the fighting?" Alice laid a hand on her head. "Don't listen to them," she said. "They're full of lies." "We called on the Holy Maiden to save this filthy world," said the leader. "We want only to lead the people into the light. With the Holy Maiden's help, we can bring peace." He looked directly at Jenny. "Your Holy Highness," he said, "please come with us." Jenny looked at the leader with her mouth open, clearly moved by his words. She hadn't seen much of the outside world, but she knew that a great many of the people out there lived in horrible suffering and hardship. If there was any way that she could help them, she couldn't see how she could refuse. "Do you remember what happened when those other people captured you?" Olivia asked her. Jenny's eyes filled with fear. She tried to fight the memories of the people who had been sent to the laboratory to be turned into hideous monsters, but it all came flooding back. "If you go with these people, they won't treat you any better than those scientists," Olivia said. Jenny covered her ears. "Shush," she said, sobbing. "I won't go. I won't." She didn't know what the Cross Church group wanted with her, but she knew she couldn't bear to undergo anything like what the scientists had put them through in the laboratory. "Don't be afraid," said Alice. "We'll protect you. If you stay with us, there's nothing anyone can do to harm you." The leader shook his head. "If that's your decision," he said, "then prepare to be purified with holy light." Two great white wings rose from behind him as the cross in his hand began to glow. He looked like an angel, a bloodthirsty and insane angel. His followers watched him with awestruck expressions. "Punish these fools," he said. "With the power of the gods, we will purify the world." His fanatics were clearly hungry to fulfill his order, but at that moment, the ground shook. "What's going on?" asked one of the followers. "What's happening?" The fanatics watched dumbstruck as the earth in front of them cracked open and the stone giant crawled out. "What kind of monster is this?" asked another follower. They looked up at the giant towering over them, their mouths open in disbelief. It was huge enough to strike fear into the hearts of even the most powerful paranormal. "We'll leave this to you," Olivia said to the giant with a smile. The stone giant raised its right fist high before crouching and bringing it pounding into the ground. It shattered the earth around its fist, sending many of the fanatics tumbling to their deaths, buried in broken rock. The survivors screamed, frozen to the spot. The sky seemed to darken above a group of them, and then a huge palm slammed down, crushing scores of them in one blow. "God save us!" screamed one of the fanatics. But his prayers were useless. He stared helplessly as the giant palm was raised in the air once again,
before coming down upon his head. "What kind of monster is this?" one of the Cross-Church group fanatics screamed, horrified to learn that the group's faith seemed to offer no protection from the blows of the stone giant. Another fanatic ran at the group leader, who blazed with holy light. "You!" he cried, grabbing the leader's sleeve. "Get your god to hurry up and show himself! Didn't you say he'd save us in our time of need? Well, I think that time might have arrived!" The leader turned to the man. "You scum," he said, scowling. "You dare to touch my clothes!" With a vague flick of his wrist, he engulfed the man in flames. Then he addressed the crowd. "Our holy maiden is before us. Our chance to purify this dirty world has come. Give your lives to the holy maiden, and I promise you that your souls will ascend to the heavens." Many of his followers had long since lost the will to live, and his words gave them some hope that at least they might find solace in the next world. But when they turned back to behold the stone giant, any confidence that he might have inspired completely vanished. It would take more than an inspiring speech to dispel their innate fear of death. "I don't want to ascend," one of them cried. "I just want to live." Many of the other fanatics tried to flee. It seemed insane to try to challenge the stone giant in a fight to the death just to appease their gods. "All who run will die," cried the leader. He brandished a holy light longsword and cut down a group of his followers trying to escape. "Betray the glory of the gods, and your souls will go to hell." His followers halted in their escape and moaned quietly in despair, so disconsolate that they couldn't even muster the energy to cry out with much volume. "Funny you should mention hell," spoke a voice into the hush. "We just came back from there." The fanatics turned to find who had spoken, and beheld the Knights of Hell, who had just ridden into their midst. Charles led his horse toward them. "Believe it or not," he continued, "the creatures down there can be a lot more honest than the people up here. It isn't such a bad place, Hell. Much better than heaven, at least." "Charles," cried Lena, her eyes lighting up. She was still a bit dizzy and disoriented after the stone giant had sent the earth shaking with its pounding blows, but she felt a new strength and stability on seeing Charles. Olivia also heaved a sigh of relief. With Charles at their side, she felt sure that they would achieve victory. Alice, too, smiled at Charles and the Knights. The church group's leader seemed undaunted by the Knights' arrival, and he faced Charles directly. "You have the nerve to compare the grandness of heaven with the filth of hell?" he asked. "You will be punished by the Lord." "I'll deal with your lord in good time," said Charles. "For now, it's you I'm interested in." He raised his crimson flame sword and he cried, "Kill them all." The Knights had been summoned using a different manner than the Gate of Hell. Because of the limits of the summoning technique, only around 30 of them had been able to accompany Charles. "Mommy!" cried Jenny. She tried to run to Elena, but was stopped by Alice, who sent a soft blue light into Jenny's body, lulling her to sleep. She knew that what was about to happen would be too cruel for her child to see. Elena looked at her daughter with a soft smile for a moment before turning her head away. "All of you will die," screamed the church group's leader. Elena had already been angry at that maniac and his followers for threatening her friends and home, but realizing that he was also threatening her daughter filled her with blinding rage. She cried at her nightmare horse and galloped at the fanatics, blazing sword energy coursing through her body. Her eyes, too, seemed to blaze with an unquenchable flame as she swept her sword energy left and right, sending bodies falling all around her. As soon as she killed one target, she moved directly to the next. She knew deep in her bones that she wouldn't, or even couldn't, rest until all her enemies lay dead in front of her. The space around Charles began to warp, and a group of slender black monsters appeared. Each held a sharp spear that flickered with cold light. Gray wings clung to their backs. Although their wings looked too frail to carry their weight, as soon as the monsters stepped through Charles's portal, they took to the air and swooped at the Church Cross group. They were shadow demons. Although they were considered lower-level creatures in hell, Charles had come to value them even more than the blade demons. Because they were very fast, they had no problem hunting down their enemies with ease. By that point, the Knights of Hell had also joined the fight. Although there weren't many of them, their number was made up of high-powered captains and stewards. Meanwhile, the church group's forces were made up of relatively low-level paranormals. The knights charged in all directions, and wherever they rode, they left corpses in their trail. Charles used an extract amulet to summon a fire dragon. It swooped down, picking up a fanatic in its jaws, before sending him crashing down to the ground. Then it quickly pounced on another. "Run!" one of the fanatics cried. "We're no match for them!" They had already been terrified by the stone giant. With the appearance of the knights, the shadow demons, and the dragon, they wondered if they weren't already in hell. Wherever they turned, they saw one after another their fellow group members killed. "Your turn," cried Charles at the leader, charging at him with his crimson flame sword aimed at the man's heart. Seeing that he would be unable to dodge in time, the man summoned a holy light barrier to protect him, but Charles's sword easily pierced it. "Sooner or later, you will all be judged," the leader screamed, his angelic wings rising high above him. He gripped his cross tightly in his trembling hands, but it could do nothing to protect him from Charles's sword energy. In one strike, Charles disposed of him. He quickly refined the man's body, charging his own with a great deal of soul energy. He could feel the leader's holy light coursing through his veins. He directed it into the energy storage space. The energy was so potent that the storage space was left dazzlingly bright, its air seeming to fizz with the power. In Charles's previous life, he had only been a step away from reaching the saint level. After absorbing the leader's energy, he felt that he was approaching that level once again. He didn't know how he would finally break through, but he could sense that he was close to doing so. He grabbed the leader's silver cross from the ground, and then he charged back into the fight. The shadow demons and the knights of hell continued their slaughter, reducing the flock of fanatics to a pile of corpses. About 300 or 400 of the fanatics turned and tried to flee, but were caught by the shadow demons. "All this time you've been waiting on a sign from your god," Charles thought. "Well, now you're about to meet him." Finally, the last fanatic was killed. Charles collected the bodies, refined their energy, and burned their corpses. "I was careless," Olivia said to Charles. "I didn't think that our enemies would be hiding in Dawn City itself. There have been some terrible consequences." Charles shook his head. "It's a big city, with the biggest trading market in the area," he said. "You couldn't possibly have kept an eye on everything." "I'm sorry too," said Lena. She felt that she had been useless in her brother's absence. It was humiliating that the Church Cross group had managed to amass so much power under her nose. "We don't have time to talk about that," said Charles, shaking his head. Olivia and Lena knew it was as close to forgiveness as they could expect from him. "We need to restore order in the city," he continued. "You guys go back and get an idea of the situation. Meanwhile, I'm going south with the knights." "You can't go alone," said Olivia. "I've heard things about this cross-church group. They're very powerful. If you're going to take them on, it's best to gather more troops." "There's no need," he said. "My knights will be sufficient." He moved the shadow demons into the energy storage space. There were so many of them that the effort to pull them all in there drained him, but he quickly recovered by using an extract amulet. Then he led the Knights of Hell away. Elena and Alice followed along with Jenny in tow, leaving Olivia and the others behind. The stone giant returned to the ground, with only the broken earth showing that it had ever been there. "All right," said Olivia with a sigh. "Let's head back." Watching Charles and his team leave, Lena was a little worried. Is he acting recklessly all over again? She wondered. Has he really learned nothing? The Church Cross group has a large force, and yet he's taking so few knights with him. I know he's strong, but will it be enough? She couldn't help but think of recent reports of paranormals who'd been using high-level powers who had died after expending their energy. It hadn't mattered that they had been high-level paranormals to begin with. Once they run out of energy, they had been finished. She worried that the same would happen with Charles and the Knights. "Only the Gate of Hell can vary all of his forces between the mortal world and Hell," said Kevin. They didn't use that this time. Instead, they used summoning magic and the stone giant to bring as many knights here as they could. They won't be able to stay in this world for long unless they make a second summoning. He knows their time here is limited, which is why he's in such a hurry. I'm sure he knows what he's doing. Lena nodded thoughtfully. "I hadn't thought of that," she said. "You've fought hard," said Olivia. "You must be tired. But we need to follow Charles's orders. Let's head back to the city." Charles and his knights charged down the road, heading south. Many highways in the area had been destroyed in the various battles between paranormals, regular warriors, and zombies. In the future, with nobody repairing the infrastructure, it would become more and more difficult for vehicles to cross large distances. There would be few who would brave driving on such dilapidated roads, knowing that they were one pothole or burst tire away from becoming stranded zombie bait. The Knights of Hell had no such problems. After all, their horses had spent their lives in hell, so that kind of terrain was no trouble to them, and they had plenty of stamina for the long journey. The knights galloped along, aware that Charles was unusually anxious. However, his nervous energy inspired them to ride ever faster. Alice caught up with Charles. "What's going on?" she asked. Elena also rode level with them, looking over at Charles inquiringly. The day had raised many questions. Although they were racing at high speed, their power level meant that they could still hold a conversation. Charles was silent for a few moments. "Jenny has a very special constitution," he said at last. "It lets her calm the chaos of soul energy. Stellar Technology must have discovered this and used it to make breakthroughs in their creation of cyborg beasts." "She can calm soul energy?" Elena asked. "Doesn't sound like such a big deal." Alice was also puzzled about the significance of such a power. "The stronger we get, the less important it is to accumulate more energy," Charles said. "Our growth at high levels isn't the same as it was at lower levels. Instead, at the higher levels, it's much more vital that we learn how to develop and channel the energy we already have, which is naturally very high anyway. If we're unable to control it properly, we're in danger of losing ourselves." Alice frowned. "You're saying that if we reach a high enough level and want to advance further," she said, trailing off. She finally understood Jenny's uniqueness. If she really had a unique ability to control high levels of soul energy, it made sense that others would want to use her for their own ends. Evidently, it held particular promise for those whose beliefs already aligned with such matters as transcendence and the afterlife. Although there were few people on Earth able to comprehend the higher levels, Charles had read in his ancient book that other worlds existed, where entire civilizations have been built as a result of such transcendence. If those worlds caught wind of Jenny's existence, they would descend on the human one like a pack of wolves. Charles was so conscious of the dangers that the future might hold that he couldn't honestly promise that he would be able to keep Jenny safe. If she was targeted and captured, it might be that the best option would be to kill her, if doing so kept their enemies from achieving previously unknown powers. On the other hand, if she really could be protected and her power harnessed for good, he couldn't help wondering if she might provide the key to restoring hope to the world. Either way, it was a dangerous game. If Charles didn't know of the despair that the future would bring, he wasn't sure that it was one he would be willing to play. "What does all this have to do with the Cross Church group?" asked Elena. "I don't fully understand," said Charles, "but it's clear that the church has come across some special knowledge or power. They appear to know about Jenny's power and think of her as their holy maiden, and they believe that they need to sacrifice her. I only found out about it recently." "Because of Sylvia's disappearance?" asked Alice. He nodded. "That's right," he said. "Olivia told me that Sylvia had left Dawn City after learning that I was returning. Around that time, I had suspected that Jenny had woken up and knew it couldn't be just a coincidence. When I returned home, I learned not only that Sylvia had left, but also that Jenny had woken up long before, and that Sylvia had stolen a portion of her power." "Why?" asked Elena. "The Holy Maiden is going to be sacrificed," said Charles. "I think that Sylvia took part of Jenny's power so that the Cross Church group would think she was the maiden instead. In her own way, I think she's protecting Jenny." "Why are you doing all this for Jenny?" asked Elena. She was deeply grateful. She had always felt guilty for not being able to protect Jenny and felt that she owed Charles a great deal. She was surprised to discover that she felt grateful to Sylvia, too. "She might be our only hope," said Charles. He was silent for a while before adding, "Sylvia must have had her reasons for doing what she did." It wasn't that he didn't know those reasons. He just didn't want to accept them. He knew that Sylvia had pretended to be the Holy Maiden so that she would be targeted in Jenny's place. A wave of frustration swept over him as he thought about the things that she had left in his room. He wished she hadn't gone off on her own, or that she had at least consulted him before carrying out her plan. In a way, he blamed himself. After all, He had been the one who had taught her many of her powers and abilities. The Knights of Hell left Montreal and continued south. They were riding so fast that the scenery around them seemed to zip by and fast forward. They paused to recharge their mounts with essence water, and then they continued toward the enemy's survival base. When they arrived at the main gate soon after, they found that there were no guards. There were numerous energy shields that had clearly been built by level 5 paranormals to defend against the bugs, but the gate itself was wide open. "This doesn't bode well," said Charles as he rode through. They reached the center of the survival base before they found anybody. A large number of people were gathered together there, deep in prayer and surrounding a burning altar. A woman wearing a veil was tied to a cross in the center of the altar. She didn't seem afraid. Even from that distance, Charles and the others recognized her as Sylvia. Many black-robed priests and white-robed nuns looked over the crowd. One of the priests was giving an impassioned speech. "This current disaster is a punishment from the gods," he shouted. "We humans have disrespected them for too long, and this is their vengeance. If we're to be saved, we must redress the balance by begging their forgiveness. If we do that, they'll send down their mighty power to cleanse this filthy world. By sending us the Holy Maiden, they've already shown us that they're willing to forgive us if only we commit ourselves to them. To show our gratitude, we must give them sacrifices. All who are burned in the name of the gods will receive the reward of holy light, which will clear the land of its darkness." As he spoke, many of the followers shuffled into the fire, allowing the flames to engulf them. They screamed with pain, but didn't try to escape the flames. So convinced were they that it was the only way of saving their souls. Charles reflected that in such a miserable world, perhaps even such a horrible death would come as a relief. With each sacrifice, the center of the altar glowed ever brighter with white flames. Many other people looked on from the buildings surrounding the altar with horror on their faces. They could only watch in baffled terror as the fanatical believers walked into the fire one after another, completely failing to understand what had possessed them to do so. "Mom! Dad! No!" cried a woman, hurrying after her parents to stop them stepping onto the burning altar. But they paid her no heed, shaking off her grip and carrying on forward. The woman lunged at them, but a holy light knife pierced her heart, and she fell to the ground. The priest who had stabbed her threw the dagger away from him as though it were somehow contagious. "Continue," he cried. Sylvia looked down with pity at those walking into the fire. When she looked at the ones who were observing the ceremony, she gave a brief involuntary smile before suppressing it. "More," she called out. "We need more sacrifices." At her command, the priests and nuns hurried the followers along into the fire. The blinding white flames burned more and more vigorously. "Sylvia, what are you doing?" Alice cried out in disbelief. Sylvia ignored her, looking to Charles instead. "I knew you'd come," she called. Her eyes glowed with the power of one who had reached the saint level. "But it's too late," she continued. "This world has become too much for me. I've decided to give myself to the gods. It's the only way I can help my fellow humans." "Stop," shouted Charles, rushing toward the altar where Sylvia was bound. He sprinted into the flames, but they didn't hurt him. He reached Sylvia and cut off the chains binding her. "How dare you!" cried one of the priests in outrage, shocked that a dissident had emerged from the crowd of compliant followers. "Who do you think you are, robbing the gods of their sacrifice?" Helena and the Knights of Hell were ready to fight. "No," said Sylvia, pushing Charles away. Her body glowed with holy light, which spread from her to the followers. They smiled with ecstasy when it fell on them. Charles took her hand. "Come back with me," he said. "It's no use," she said. "You can't save everyone in this world." The holy light left her eyes, and he caught a glimpse of the real Sylvia inside. She looked at him imploringly. "My death is neither an escape nor a defeat," she said. "I'm dying on my own terms." The flames surged higher and higher. Priests and nuns continued to charge into them, adding to the blaze. Suddenly, Sylvia glared at Charles with a fierce look. He felt a great pressure pressing down on him, seeming to constrict his every cell. "What is this?" he asked in shock and fury. It seemed something had physically grabbed hold of him, dragging him downwards. The flames grew ever higher, inspiring even more of the followers to rush into it and add further fuel.
Listen to me, said Sylvia. I truly believe that there's a God that will save the world. But this God, its will is so vast that whether it saves or destroys the world, it'll only be a passing interest in its greater plan.
Charles was unfazed. He hated those who believed in gods because their faith opened them up to manipulation. Their blind obedience seemed to him like an abandonment of the natural intelligence of all humans. However, although he knew that no gods truly existed in the world, the apocalypse had shown that there were plenty of creatures with almost divine power who walked the earth. "What's your plan?" he asked.
I'm not fit for this world, she said, and I'm too tired to change that. This is a good ending for me. You've always said that you want your followers to have their own thoughts and make their own choices. Well, this is my choice, and even if you don't agree with it, I ask that you respect it.
By that point, the fire had grown so great that it had engulfed all the priests, the nuns, and the believers. They had all been consumed by the fire with expressions of manic joy on their faces. Alice created a wall of water to stop the holy light from spreading any further. Still, she was terrified, and so were those watching from the shadows. It had been one thing for them to hear of such happenings, and another to see them with their own eyes. They had thought that after seeing people eaten by zombies, they'd become desensitized to horrific sights. But the mindless fanatics throwing themselves on the fire was evidence enough that there was still plenty of horror in the world. Sylvia's body grew brighter and brighter with holy light.
Betraying the gods is the same as betraying your soul, she said, and betraying your soul is the same as betraying all of humanity.
The light glowed so brightly that Charles could no longer make out her outline. When she spoke, it was as if only her will existed, and her physical presence had disappeared.
And all those who oppose the gods and humanity will pay the price, she boomed.
The holy light condensed into the form of a long sword. Meanwhile, the sky above filled with dark clouds, flickering with lightning, seeming like they would burst with rain at any moment. The longsword stabbed straight into the ground. Its cross-shaped hilt shone white, but black lines of death energy began to spread from the pommel, along the handle, over the hilt, and down the blade. "You owe your life to me," said Charles calmly, even though he wasn't sure who or what he was talking to anymore. Still, he didn't need to raise his voice to give it authority. "That means you don't die until I say so." And with that, he created a soul seal, trapping Sylvia's soul with 12 magical binds. It encased her aura into a smaller and smaller spot, until with a snap, the light that had surrounded her disappeared. In the place where she had been bound, a crystal cross fell to the ground. Charles bent down and picked it up. "Maybe you were right when you said you weren't fit for this world," he thought, "but that doesn't mean you won't have a chance when we've built the next one. I hope that you'll wake up after this long rest to a new world full of love." He stepped toward the sword, frowning at the black lines of death energy spreading across it. "So this is the gods' punishment, is it?" he wondered. "Well, whoever you gods are, one of these days I'm going to find you and take you down a peg or two." He picked up the sword and took it over to Elena and Jenny. "These are both for Jenny," he said. He hung the cross around Jenny's neck and turned the sword into a mark of holy light, which he sealed onto her arm. Elena was worried to see Charles had given Jenny a weapon. Weapons are only for those who need to fight, she thought. Is he preparing her to fight alongside us? She's only 9 years old. "Charles, this is..." She trailed off. She understood that they were living in a world where most had no choice but to fight. It was cruel, but perhaps the greater cruelty would be to leave Jenny with no way of defending herself at all. She knew that those in Dawn City had done all they could to protect Jenny. With her existence and location exposed, there was no telling who else might try to capture her. She was a kind child, and as she was beginning to understand her own importance, Elena found it difficult to imagine that she would simply allow other people to sacrifice themselves in her name while she did nothing. "I understand," she said, wiping away some tears. Charles noted her pained expression, but kept himself from comforting her. Instead, he turned to Alice. "Take Jenny back," he said. "Tell Olivia and the military what happened here.
Spread the word through the Super Squad Guild. Many parties will be watching to see what we do next. In fact, Sylvia might have done this on purpose just to draw attention to us. After what happened today, we need to prepare as many people as possible for what might come next. He knew that if his followers weren't assured of their own protection and survival, they might abandon him. He was aware that the onlookers in the buildings around them, who had already witnessed one kind of authority in the Cross-Church group, were judging his every move and decision to see what kind of leader he was. But he couldn't let himself get too concerned about such things. He needed only to make sure that he protected as many innocents as he could. That was the only sure way to win the hearts of the people. As he had expected, there were many in the eastern states who had designs to attack the Cross-Church group. However, he couldn't factor them into his plans. He had been able to seal Sylvia's soul in the cross, allowing her to slumber free from the torment that had led her to such drastic action. He knew that he needed to focus on making the world a better place for when she was released. Still, he couldn't completely disregard his conflicted emotions, which at times felt like the mortal enemy of his reason. If he could, he would seal his heart just as securely as he had done with Sylvia's. After handing Jenny over to Alice, Charles reversed the summoning ritual, sending himself, Elena, and his knights back to Hell. They soon found Mark and the other knights, accompanied by the Cerberus. Anthony opened his mouth to ask something, but held back when he caught the cold look in Charles's eyes. "We're near the home of the Golden Beetle tribe, right?" Charles asked the Cerberus. Before returning to the mortal realm, Charles and the knights had been on a mission to destroy the Golden Beetle tribe.
"That's right,"
said the Cerberus.
"They don't have too many high-level warriors, but even their regular soldiers are very well defended. Only your Crimson Flame swords will be able to cut through their armor and cause actual damage. Any other weapons will only be good for buying time."
Mark stepped forward.
"What tactics should we use?"
he asked. Charles's aura was so daunting that the others didn't dare approach him. However, as commander of the Knights of Hell, Mark knew that he needed to ask the question. "Protect the area around the camp and make sure nobody escapes," said Charles. Then he rode Bullet down to the camp. Mark was confused, but he had to accept that order as an order.
"Listen up,"
he called to the knights.
"We need to surround their territory and stop anyone from escaping."
The knights rushed to obey as one formidable unit. When they arrived at the camp, though, they were stunned to find Charles already in the midst of battle. When he had left to reach the camp, the tribe's guards had sprung into action. The tribe was made up of giant beetles walking on their hind legs. They towered over humans and would grow even larger when they reached level 6. Their bodies were covered in golden shells, which were so bulky that it was difficult to imagine that the beetles could move very fast. However, their pincers and claws were extremely sharp, easily able to snap through the knights' dark iron armor and swords like pliers through copper wire. Charles had a crimson flame sword in one hand and the sword of death in the other. Without pausing, he launched at the guards, cutting the heads off the first two who stood in his way. No matter their strength, their eyesight was bad, so it was easy to rush them. By the time the knights arrived, Charles had already killed the first two beetles. Others were enraged that he had so easily killed their guards. They waved their pincers in the air and charged at him. His crimson flame sword flashed through the air as he cut forward and to the side, taking down beetle after beetle. His mind was still overcast after the situation with Sylvia, and he channeled his negative emotions through his sword strokes. His 10 years as combat experience had taught him how to control his negative emotions in a healthier way, but all he wanted to do in that moment was to vent them through killing. And so, with a red sword in one hand and a black sword in the other, he massacred the golden beetles. His focus was so great that he dodged each of their attacks. The red sword energy flashed and another beetle fell. He wasn't fighting according to any established technique. Instead, he acted on muscle memory alone, reaching a flow state where he hardly needed to think about what he was doing. With the added help of his preservation ability, he had no need to think about technique or theory. His long years of experience had etched each swipe and lunge into his very soul. One by one, the golden beetles fell to the ground. As they fell, a giant beetle over 30 feet tall stormed onto the battlefield, its carapace shimmering with a golden light. It brandished the giant pincers on its hands and swung them at Charles, trying desperately to stop the enemy who had dared to invade its territory. Charles knew that if his attack failed, the beetle would cleave him in two, right through his dark iron armor. He jumped onto the beetle's massive pincers, then he tapped lightly on them with the tip of his foot and launched himself high enough to meet the beetle's gaze. "You're finished," he shouted. His expression glazed with a cold indifference as he stared into the beetle's beady eyes. His sword of death had disappeared, and an invisible innate sword energy burst from within him. The extremely sharp energy cut through the beetle's huge mouth, and its broken mandibles clattered to the ground. The beetle gaped in shock and started to reach down to pick up its mandibles, but as it stooped over, Charles pierced its head with his crimson flame sword. It toppled over on its side, crushing two other beetles that couldn't dodge out of the way in time. But Charles didn't stop there. He summoned the Sword of Death again in his free hand, and he cut through the mob of angry insects with both of his blades. Every time he swung one of the swords, a beetle would crumple to the ground. The beetles tried desperately to land their attacks on Charles, but he easily dodged them all. And when the beetles' attempts failed, they were left wide open to his counterattacks. One after another, they fell in battle. Caught up in his bloodlust and unaware of how much time had passed, Charles snapped out of his frenzy and suddenly realized that he was the only one left standing on the battlefield. As he looked around, he saw the ground was littered with hundreds of dead beetles. The surviving beetles kneeled on the ground in surrender, chittering in distress. When the Knights of Hell arrived and saw the carnage Charles had wrought on the Golden Beetle tribe, they felt a chill in their hearts. They had all witnessed the strength of the hellish creatures, and they knew that their bodies had to be incredibly tough to survive the harsh environment of hell. But to Charles, the Golden Beetle tribe was nothing more than a bunch of cockroaches, and he had single-handedly exterminated them. "Am I seeing things?" one of the knights said, rubbing his eyes. "Isn't that giant dead beetle a level 7 hellish creature? This must be how strong Mayor Federer really is," another said in astonishment. "He took out the whole tribe on his own, including the level 7 monsters. He's incredible!" As they spoke, the knights' eyes glimmered with excitement and awe at how powerful their leader was. Charles had created a place for them to survive and call their home, and they knew he would give his all to protect them. They felt that being able to follow such an immensely powerful expert like him was an honor. Charles inserted a knight's spear made of unholy cold iron into the ground. As the basis of the contract between species, before the spear was destroyed, the golden beetles had to surrender to the spear's owner. After subduing the beetles, Charles felt that there was still more to be done. His stomach still churned with a murderous rage, and he hadn't fully vented the negative emotions that were percolating within him. Miranda looked at him with a pained expression, but she didn't stop him. She knew that suppressing emotions wasn't always possible or healthy, and it was okay to vent those emotions as long as it didn't hurt other people. Charles's negative emotions were too strong to ignore. He hadn't had the strength to protect the people around him in his previous life, and he hadn't expected that he would be reborn and get a second chance. He knew that if he didn't release the negative emotions that had been stewing inside of him for so many years, he was bound to snap. In Miranda's eyes, no matter how strong Charles acted, he was still just a young man in his 20s who had been forced to bear a heavy burden. She hated to see him overcome by his anger, and she feared it would be his undoing. Meanwhile, Elena and Charles set off to continue the slaughter. Elena had the Terminator sword ability Divine Seed in her body, the divine ability that Charles had chosen in his previous life. Due to Charles's familiarity with the ability, which he had cultivated with his guidance, she had quickly mastered her power. Anxiety about her inability to protect Jenny gnawed away at her, and during the massacre, she killed one enemy after another to numb herself to her feelings. As the saying goes, the best defense is a good offense, and the Terminator's sword ability was proof. When faced with an enemy's attack, Elena's most common defensive maneuver was to cut off the enemy's claws mid-attack. Using the Terminator's sword ability, her fighting style was straightforward but brutally efficient. Wherever she went, bloodshed would follow. Over the next 6 hours, Charles and Elena destroyed a total of 7 settlements, including 2 giant demon camps and 1 magma monster camp. In that short span of time, they disposed of thousands of enemies, including 5 level 7 monsters. However, Charles wasn't in the mood to think about just how much damage they had inflicted with just 2 people. All that mattered to him was that his bloodlust had finally been sated for the time being. He and Elena returned to the rest of the group, and he announced that the battle was over. When the two stopped their slaughter, the Knights of Hell heaved a sigh of relief. They had experienced horrific scenes before, but they still felt their bodies tremble when they saw Charles and Elena slaughtering thousands of enemies like it was nothing. After all, fear of the strong was a deep-seated human instinct. "We're done for now," Charles said to them. "There's no need for us to continue expanding our territory, because we won't be able to protect it all. What we need to do now is to try our best to stabilize these occupied territories and eliminate any threats. From now on, the 30 teams will move freely in different units," he continued. "But we need to use our commanders as the core of these units. We have to be able to provide support to each other when any of us are in danger. Consider this another part of your training." "Yes, sir," the knights responded in unison. "Now all of you listen carefully," he said, his gaze sweeping across everyone's faces. The knights felt like they were going to stop breathing as they hung on his every word. "All of you had better come back alive," he said firmly. "I don't want any of you dying on me out there." After the massacre of the tribes of Hell had ended, Charles chose a quiet place to meditate and regulate his breathing. He had finally managed to vent most of his negative emotions, and he knew that if he continued to immerse himself in the pleasure of killing, he would harm the people around him. So he tried his best to calm his remaining bloodlust as he focused on his breaths. Elena also stopped to collect herself after battle, but only after Charles had forced her to. Miranda accompanied the two of them. She knew that they had become full of murderous rage after they had gone back to Dawn City, but she didn't dare to ask what had happened there. She didn't want to open any wounds that might still be raw. Elena was exhausted from all the fighting. It was easy for her to sink into a meditative state when her body barely had the energy to stand. As she focused inward, a powerful aura began to spread around her. Charles looked at her in surprise. He hadn't expected her to understand her divine abilities so quickly. Although her tremendous increase in power was mostly due to his teaching, her determination to protect Jenny played a large part as well. He turned his thoughts back to himself, knowing that he shouldn't disturb her meditation or try to teach her too much. There were some things she had to learn on her own, and he wouldn't interfere with her training. He also already had his work cut out for him in calming his own mind. He focused inward on his energy storage space and began to adjust the structure of the world inside of it. Since he had been the one to open the energy storage space, it was under his control. But just like how a person couldn't control the function of their organs or the direction of their blood flow, he could only control the space in certain ways. For example, if he wanted to control the flow of soul energy inside the space, it wouldn't take too much of his own energy. But to increase the speed at which the crops grew, he would need to expend more and more energy over time. The faster he increased their growth speed, the greater the burden on his body. If he wanted a seed to mature in an instant, or to change the structure of some atoms or molecules, the energy consumption needed might cause the space to teeter on the brink of a total collapse. So he knew that the best way to use the space to its full potential was to understand its rules and work within their bounds. In the previous battle, he had sent a large number of corpses into the space for the Dark Dwarves to process. They had extracted the parts that could be forged into weapons, and the remaining parts had been burned like trash. The process didn't create any harmful waste products, as everything could be converted into soul energy and reused. During the 2 days that Charles had been in Hell, the energy storage space had increased by 50% in terms of the amount of materials it held and the overall size of the space. At that moment, the space was about as big as a city. However, because of the limitations of the space and of Charles's control of it, a lot of it was still empty or littered with various materials that had yet to be converted into pure soul energy. The spirit spring in the middle of the space had already condensed into a large lake. Although it was only a little more than 1,000 acres wide, it was already a few hundred feet deep. Its waters were an extremely rich source of soul energy. Unfortunately, if the water left the energy storage space, its power quickly dissipated in the outside world. Charles often used the spring's water to quickly recover his troops' physical strength and energy, but the water could only be preserved for 5 hours, limiting its usefulness. If I could find a way to preserve the water for longer, then we could sell it, Charles thought as he observed the spring. He knew that with his strength and influence, even if he were to expose his hidden treasure trove of soul energy and crafting materials in the energy storage space, very few people would be brave enough to try to steal from him. Only someone as strong as him could protect the treasures he held, and he knew he would need to grow even stronger as the space expanded and the wealth of resources it held increased in turn. He had harvested tough shells from the golden beetles and sturdy bones from the magma monsters that he had just slaughtered. Both types of material were good for forging weapons. Although he had a large amount of dark iron, there were benefits in diversifying his supply of weapons. He knew that creating new weapons would also entice more people to join the Super Squad Guild. Meanwhile, he ordered the others to use the giant demon and minotaur hides to create various bags and clothes. In the few months since the apocalypse had begun, people had already learned how to use the skin of mutated beasts, as well as some mutated tree bark, to make clothes and backpacks. However, the plants and animals in the mortal world had only just begun to mutate. How could those materials compare to parts from creatures that had survived the scorching heat of endless hellfire for hundreds, even thousands of years? In just 2 days, Charles and the Knights had destroyed several giant demon settlements, killing several thousand demons, and providing enough raw materials to make clothes for everyone in Dawn City. However, Charles would never hand out the clothes for free. He felt that giving things away for free would result in an ungrateful populace. The more he gave them, the less they would appreciate it. On top of that, giving the materials away would make people think that they were cheap goods. But if he sold the materials at a high price to outsiders and a discounted price to the Dawnians would feel even more grateful toward him. He wasn't worried that someone would sell them at a high price after buying them at a low price. The food and equipment in Dawn City were limited, and citizens had to have a special certificate to buy them at a reduced price. If someone wanted to sell their limited goods to outsiders, everyone would turn a blind eye to it, as it wouldn't affect their own share of supplies. Charles spent 10 hours in meditation. During that time, he sorted out the energy storage space, and then he raised his cultivation base to level 6. But he felt his body sending him a warning as a sense of foreboding washed over him, and he began to stop his cultivation efforts. Just as he was about to turn his focus back to the outside world, the energy storage space gradually stabilized. Then the life and death energy inside began to converge, causing the entire space to shake. Charles felt his stomach sink. That's not good, he thought. I can't let anything happen to the energy storage space. Charles felt uneasy about the disturbance he sensed in the energy storage space, but after he carefully examined the space, his uneasiness slowly faded away. The energy storage space was equivalent to an entire world and all of the life and energy within it. Although it was far away from the outside world, it was still real. After Charles had comprehended the power of life and death, the space had already changed into a real world. However, just like how humans needed to absorb nutrients in order to grow, the space also needed nutrients to support its own growth. Charles sensed that after the space had expanded, it had experienced another fundamental change within it. The white stone from the Deathwater monster's body was slowly releasing the power of life, and that power was gradually changing the space over time. Amid those changes, the tree ants in the space and the crops they tended to seemed to have undergone some sort of transformation. And it still feels like something's missing here, Charles thought, but what could it be? His intuition told him that the energy storage space still hadn't settled into a perfect balance. He knew that if it were to keep growing at the same pace without added support, its future foundation would be unstable. At a glance, the space seemed like it was full of life, but Charles still felt that there was a lack of vitality there. Something unique to life was missing, but he couldn't think of what it was, so he didn't linger on it. He turned his focus to the crops that the tree ants were tending to. Many of the crops had already matured and were ready to harvest. In just a few months, the space had already produced 20,000 tons of food, including enough grains and vegetables to feed 30,000 people for a year. If he used the soul energy of the space to increase the speed of the plants' growth, he would be able to produce more than 10 times that amount of food in a short period of time. Additionally, there were still many energy sources in the space that he had yet to utilize, so he realized he had nothing to worry about. Seeing the mountain of food he had created, Charles felt much more at ease. The country had experienced several disasters in his past life, and people had frequently run out of supplies and starved to death. The looming shadow of starvation always weighed heavily on his mind. Even with all the food he had produced, he still felt that he could find a way to produce more while maintaining the stability of the energy storage space. He took out a handful of wheat from the space and looked at it closely. Something's not quite right with these grains, he thought. Miranda noticed him staring intently at his hands and looked curiously at the wheat he held. At that moment, the wheat quickly shriveled up like the life had been sucked out of it. "We're in hell, remember?" Miranda said to him with a smile. There's no way ordinary wheat can survive here. Hell was covered in an endlessly burning blanket of hellfire, and anyone who visited from the mortal world had to watch their step. One wrong move would result in their untimely death. But the searing heat and constant threat of the hellfire had been one of the reasons the Knights of Hell had increased their strength so significantly in their time there. After a short while, regular hellfire had become nothing more than a warm bonfire to them. That's right, Charles muttered to himself. Hell is a harsh environment. His eyes lit up as he finally understood what the problem was. What his energy storage space lacked was adversity. The space had no lack of energy or nutrients, and he had plenty of water to provide what he had thought was the best environment for the growth of his crops. But at that moment, he realized that the environment he had created might not be the best source of growth after all. Like humans, crops were also a type of life, and life could only truly grow after experiencing hardships. Even though Charles had produced many more crops than were available in the outside world, their quality was about the same, as the crops outside had to survive the harsh world of the apocalypse. The treants were like the crops, and their growth would also hit a limit if they were kept in a paradise free of strife. Life had always fought against harsh environments to survive, and the cruel reality of nature was what caused life to evolve and become stronger. Creatures at the top of the food chain would eventually become complacent and lazy, and their growth would stagnate over time. With this realization, Charles willed the water in the canals and the energy storage space to evaporate, forming dark clouds in the sky. Lightning crackled and thunder boomed as countless lightning bolts struck the farmlands, destroying many crops. Some of the bolts struck the treants, leaving scorch marks on their wooden bodies. The treants trembled with shock and anger, not knowing what kind of madness had overcome Charles to make him hurt them. Some of the fruits on the treants' bodies fell to the ground, where they quickly began to sprout, and the crops underwent a similar transformation after their destruction. What would seem like a disaster to an outside spectator was a complete triumph to Charles. The originally dull and placid energy storage space was surging with the chaos and conflict of life. The essence of life is to grow in adversity, he thought. Humans need to struggle against something to become stronger, and everything else in the world is like us in that way. With another thought from Charles, the treant seeds that had just sprouted grew once again. Then they rose from the ground and fell into the garbage dump, which was used for zombie parts and some contaminated water and soil that Charles had collected. At first, he had wanted to use the energy storage space's ability to purify the contaminated things into pure soul energy, but after his epiphany about the nature of life, he had changed his mind. He realized that trying to develop everything according to his wishes had been an affront to the wild and uncontrollable nature of life itself. After the treant saplings entered the polluted water and soil, half of them died in less than 5 minutes, while the rest were all on the verge of death. However, even in the incredibly polluted environment, the saplings that had managed to survive grew with all their might. I might have overdone it, Charles thought as he watched the treants struggle. Going too hard on them will destroy their hope. But I have some test subjects now, so I might as well use them. The pain Charles had experienced in his past life had worn away his compassion long ago, and he had no qualms about sacrificing other species to accomplish his goals. The treants he had struck with lightning had yet to evolve any semblance of intelligence, but he wouldn't hesitate to do the same to even the more intelligent creatures if they didn't meet his standards. He planned to use more lightning storms to cull the weak treants that sprouted from the saplings in the toxic waste dump, leaving only the strongest treants alive. After conquering the different tribes of Hell, his energy storage space was full of several hundred new workers. He allocated some of them to the Dark Dwarves, who used them as laborers to move bricks. The rest became part of his cannon fodder unit. After his consciousness left the space, Charles felt a wave of something like hunger wash over him. He pulled out some extract amulets that stored large amounts of pure soul energy, and he channeled their energy throughout his body, rapidly increasing his strength. But after his strength rose to the peak of level 6, he stopped. He felt that he had yet to reach his limit, and he could have easily continued to increase his power. However, he knew that if he continued to improve, then he wouldn't be able to return home for a while. Feeling the immense aura emanating from Charles, Miranda looked both uneasy and determined. She had always wanted to be someone who was useful to Charles, and she didn't want him to leave her behind. But after his cultivation level had increased again, the gap between his and her strength had also widened. Nevertheless, she believed that she wouldn't be left too far behind. No matter how strong Charles became, she would never give up on trying to catch up to him. After a day of battling on their own, the Knights of Hell came back to camp to rest. While there, Charles gave them a new order to collect all kinds of plants and seeds from Hell, which would be counted toward their merit points. Although they didn't understand why Charles gave such an order, the Knights were used to obeying his every word without question. On top of that, the temptation of acquiring more merit points made them even more eager to follow orders. With more merit points, they would be first in line to buy any new equipment or medicine Charles made. The Knights' expedition for plants and seeds lasted for about a week. When they returned, all of them looked shell-shocked. 5 Knights had died on their journey after they had stumbled into unexpectedly strong enemies. Additionally, more than 70 of the reserve Knights had died due to the dangerous plants in the area. Charles's heart ached at the loss. The Knights were all important to him, and he felt the weight of every single one of their deaths bear down on him. However, he had just experienced the transformation of the energy storage space after the storms he had created, and he knew that the trauma and hardship the Knights had suffered would help them grow into stronger warriors. On top of the Knights who had perished, several paranormals had also died on the mission. The paranormals had been stronger than most of the Knights, but their greed had gotten them killed. Because Charles's offer of merit points had been so generous, they had gone out of their way to challenge more powerful monsters and to collect more dangerous plants. Their strength had made them cocky, and they had taken on far more than they could handle, resulting in their untimely deaths. Since it had been their own choice to try to get more merit points in the face of danger, Charles didn't feel much sympathy for them. He would make sure their families were properly taken care of, and their merit points would go to their surviving comrades. After returning with the spoils of battle and sorting out how many merit points the 30 different teams had earned, everyone returned to Dawn City. The teams' rankings had been issued based on the number of merit points they had accumulated from killing monsters and harvesting plants and seeds. The Reserve Knights' ranking would also be decided based on their teams' ranking. However, Charles added a rule to the ranking system. If a team had lost members in battle, those members' merit points would be converted into rewards for the surviving members, but wouldn't be included in the team's ranking. In other words, if people had died in a team, their teammates might receive more rewards than others, but their overall ranking would be lower. This would make it more difficult for the Reserve Knights to be promoted to official Knights. It would also discourage people from letting their teammates die in order to kill more monsters for merit points. "This isn't fair," one of the Reserve Knights complained. "Why should we be punished for their mistakes?" "You can't even protect your teammates now," Charles retorted. "If I promote you to an official Knight, you'll just send more people to their deaths." He needed a brave and fearless army, and he knew that survival in the apocalypse was a marathon and not a sprint. If he lost too many of his forces so soon after the apocalypse had begun, then Dawn City would suffer in the long term. A few commanders noticed how hard he had worked to train the Knights, and they talked to each other about his efforts. "Mayor Federer really did take everything into account," one said. "He made that rule to remind us that we shouldn't risk our lives for greed." "He may seem tough, but he's keeping our best interests at heart," another replied with a nod. "We're lucky to have him as a leader. No matter what the others might think about him, he's doing his best to keep us alive." After Charles returned to Dawn City, he promoted 3 more captains to become paladins, and he also promoted 6 stewards to become captains, resulting in 36 total teams of knights. There were a total of 6 paladins, and each paladin was in charge of 6 teams. From that moment on, the stewards would be under the direct command of the captains of their teams. Unless there was an emergency, the paladins couldn't give orders directly to the stewards. After a week of non-stop fighting, the knights' increased strength was readily apparent. Every knight had reached level 5, whether due to their own battle experience or due to help with the use of extract amulets. The news of the creation of a large team of level 5 knights quickly spread, causing a sensation throughout the entire region. For some time, there had been people who had overestimated their own abilities and had wanted to threaten Dawn City. But after the knights had returned home and had shown off their new abilities, those ambitious people had given up on their plans, knowing it would be foolish to challenge a city guarded by such powerful warriors. The Knights of Hell increased the number of open slots for reserve knights, causing many people to rush to apply. The vacancies in the official knight positions also caused intense competition among the reserve knights. Charles had no interest in interfering with their competition. He felt that as long as they didn't use despicable means to sabotage each other, there was no need for him to get involved. The knights were all practically family, and very few of them would dare to act against each other. They knew that if they did anything to harm another knight, the others might not help them on the battlefield if they found themselves in danger. A few days after Charles and the knights' return, a large group of paranormals started looking for Charles. Led by the counselors, they were all level 5, and they were effectively the backbone of Dawn City. Olivia had slept with Charles, so the counselors knew she would likely side with him regarding any issues. They eyed him with concern as they entered the room. "What's going on?" he asked them. "Did something big happen that you need my help with?" He sat down on a chair woven from the branches of a level 5 tree ant. Then he looked at the counselors blankly, while Olivia stood behind him and started to rub his shoulders. The counselors looked at each other and smiled bitterly. Alex took a step forward. "Mayor Federer, those paranormals who went to hell with you have already reached level 5, he said. "On top of that, a lot of them have special equipment that they can use to store some energy or to launch some more powerful attacks." He was referring to certain equipment Charles had made for specific people, like Zach's wrist guard. The equipment had no special properties of its own. It only stored a paranormal's existing power, but it could prove to be a deadly tool in battle. The attack power of a paranormal far surpassed that of a martial artist, but the energy in their body was limited. Even if the equipment could increase their superpower storage by just a slight amount, it would greatly increase their survivability. For example, when they first reached level 5, fire-type paranormals could use the equipment to exert greater control over their true fire abilities, as they came to grips with how to use them properly. This allowed them to master powerful abilities faster than ever before. The same thing applied to the other elemental paranormal types, as well as the bio-altered types, who were happy with simply receiving any weapon that Charles had personally forged. "Is there a problem with that?" Charles said calmly. "Why shouldn't I empower my strongest fighters with the best equipment?" "We all know that Dawn City adheres to the principle of giving benefits based on a person's hard work and contribution, so this isn't about fairness," Alex replied. "It's just that the level 5 paranormals who reach that level on their own are upset that the others are surpassing them." "Then they'll just have to work harder," Charles said. "As long as they do their fair share, I can help them customize their equipment." Alex forced a pained smile. "The problem with that is they don't have the chance to earn as much credit as the others," he said. The best way to obtain credit in Dawn City was to kill high-level mutated beasts and zombies. But besides needing the strength to kill them, this also required encountering the rarer high-level creatures in the first place. Although the Knights of Hell had suffered several casualties on their last expedition, the paranormals in the city had only seen all of the loot they had returned home with. As the lower-level fighters started to surpass the paranormals in power, the paranormals felt threatened by their newfound power. They were bitter that they didn't have a way to increase their own power to so greatly in such a short time. Olivia lowered her head and continued to rub Charles's shoulders. Half of the paranormals who had gone to hell were her subordinates. Since she had reaped the rewards of their expedition too, she felt no need to question Charles's judgment. Some of the paranormals who had sided with the counselors had also secretly sought her out, looking to join her ranks. However, she didn't want to start any trouble with the counselors, so she had rejected their request. Seeing that Charles was silent, Taylor jumped in to support Alex. "He's right," he said. "The paranormals are starting to complain, asking why the others are stronger than they are, and why they don't have the same chances to obtain credit that the others do. Absolute fairness doesn't exist, even if a system itself is fair. It was up to Charles to decide how much he wanted to intervene to make things as fair as possible for everyone in Dawn City. Since he had given the other paranormals fewer opportunities to contribute, they felt like he was playing favorites with his knights and the paranormals who supported them. Some of the paranormals thought he might have favored the lower-level fighters because he thought that those people would remain more loyal to him than the higher-level fighters who could fend for themselves. But even those paranormals still felt that his preferential treatment was somewhat unfair. Despite this, the upset paranormals knew that if they left Charles in Dawn City, they would lose their opportunity to acquire benefits at a low price. Charles hesitated for a moment. "If that's the case, I might be able to arrange something," he finally said. "We're not afraid of dangerous or dirty work as long as we're properly compensated for it," Taylor eagerly replied. The paranormals wanted to earn their keep. They had the ability to fight for a better life for themselves, but they felt they hadn't been given the chance to flex their skills. Watching a group of people who were weaker than them surpass them made them very uncomfortable. Even if they had to risk their lives, they wanted to become stronger than the others again. Charles nodded. All right, I happen to have some things that need to be done, but they're dangerous. Since those paranormals are willing to take the risk, I'll help them, and if they die, I'll compensate them. The 4 counselors were excited to hear that Charles was offering extra opportunities to them and their followers. I don't care if the people on my team turn to Charles instead, thought Jason. What's important is that they're given a chance to develop their skills. The other counselors thought along the same lines. If their subordinates were granted an opportunity to grow stronger, they didn't care if it was Charles who made it happen. Their open-mindedness on the matter showed that they truly wanted the best for their followers, which was the greatest virtue of any leader. They knew that if they didn't allow their followers every chance to improve themselves, they could hardly expect to keep them at their side for very long. Their followers had benefited from the equipment and resources that they had received under the counselor's command, and Charles's promise was just another benefit of staying loyal to Dawn City. Our strongest forces at the moment are the Knights of Hell, said Charles, and I'll be adding to their number by recruiting more reserve knights. At the moment, each team of knights is made up of 12 official knights, backed up by 4 reserves. From now on, 6 of these teams will form a battalion with the paladins in charge. He listed each of the knights and the teams they were to join. But an army isn't only made up of its soldiers, he added. It also needs scouts. The assembled group was particularly interested to hear that Charles would be recruiting scouts. As far as they were concerned, scouts were an army's most valued asset. Of all the soldiers in an army, they were at the greatest risk, and people discussed them with a kind of awe. It was the scouts, after all, who had to run ahead and make the first encounter with the enemy army. The counselors weren't prepared to take on such a risk themselves. They already held positions of great power, so it was unlikely that they would put their lives on the line in the most dangerous position on the battlefield. To become a scout, you need the strength and judgment of a captain, said Charles. You'll also need to pass my test. Needless to say, you'll be rewarded generously for your risks. Even the regular soldiers who sign up to become scouts will enjoy the same treatment as the paladins. And in the event of your deaths, you'll be regarded as martyrs. Assuming you haven't betrayed Dawn City, that is. He took out a few pieces of paper and handed them to the counselors. You have to sign up yourself if you want to be a scout, he said. Nobody will be forced to do it. But if you do want to sign up, you have to be completely truthful in your application. The counselors stared at the paper in their hands, and Charles cleared his throat to regain their attention. I have another matter to discuss, he said. We're going to open a trade route. The counselors looked from one to the other, confused. Dawn City has become a capital of industry, he said. We produce all kinds of materials and weapons. What we lack is mineral resources. Meanwhile, the northern and southwestern states have many resources, and there are many zombies and mutated animals waiting to be killed and harvested in the Midwest. If we can open up a trade route to those regions, the benefits will be enormous. We'll also gain the gratitude of many people, as well as expanding our influence. The military has established a strong position in Maryland and the surrounding states, so we don't need to worry about running into danger there, said Olivia. But the journey to the southwest will be very long. We'll focus on that later. For now, our aim is to open routes into the Midwest. The counselors frowned. They understood the reasoning behind the new plan, and they appreciated the benefits that the trade routes would bring. But it sounds so dangerous, said Taylor. The others nodded. The areas outside the survival bases were dense with zombies and mutated animals, not to mention human bandits and robbers, who they were almost guaranteed to encounter. On top of that, the highways across the country had deteriorated so badly that it was very dangerous to travel. If it wasn't dangerous, I wouldn't be entrusting it with you, said Charles, sneering at the counselors as concern. If you're too scared to take on the task, I can always just ask my knights. That's not what we meant, said one of the counselors. He and the other 3 counselors were well aware of just how powerful the Knights of Hell were, and that they would have no problems opening the routes if Charles gave them the job instead. They also knew that Olivia was more powerful than the 4 of them combined and could easily do the job too. They realized they had nothing to bargain with. If they protested, Charles would simply give the job to someone else, and they would be left with nothing. Alex gritted his teeth. we accept the mission, he said. Don't be so scared, said Charles. It's not like I'm treating you as cannon fodder. I don't want to lose anyone. Anyway, for the first part of the mission, I'll send 3 battalions of knights to follow you. If you're in danger, you'll be able to call on them for assistance. But making use of the knights will lower your mission rating and reduce your benefits. And you'll have more people to share your bounty with, of course. Olivia had already contacted the partner that they would be trading with, a force established by the military and some veterans. You'll be able to use this opportunity not only to get resources for Dawn City, but also to purchase goods for yourselves, she said. You can sell those at any of the survival bases and keep the profits. With that carrot dangling in front of them, there was no way the counselors could refuse. The dangers of the mission felt much less intimidating when they learned that the knights would act as their bodyguards. The dangers were still very present in their minds, but they no longer felt quite so fearsome. Just remember that I don't promise these benefits lightly, Charles said, his tone turning so cold that each of the counselors felt a chill rush down their spine. You need to take this mission very seriously. If anyone tries to take advantage of my kindness and make off with my goods, I'll track you down and punish you myself. The counselors almost tripped over themselves trying to convince Charles of their reliability. Of course not, sir. We never think of betraying you. They glanced nervously at each other and saw that each had a sheen of nervous sweat on their forehead. Although they held relatively high positions in Dawn City, they knew that they had no right to object to anything Charles said. They could only accept his orders. You should be aware that we lost some of the goods that the Super Squad Guild was transporting, said Olivia. In some cases, these were simple accidents. In other cases, not. To prove your trustworthiness, think of this as a chance to compensate for those losses. The counselors all nodded furiously, aware that they could do nothing other than accept their fate. Olivia had put them in their place, making it clear that they needed to take responsibility for not only their individual roles, but also for the sloppiness and disloyalty of the Super Squad Guild. We'll make up for all the lost goods, said Alex, forcing a smile. It wasn't news that a portion of the goods that had been transported from Dawn City to other areas had mysteriously disappeared along the way, and it was no real mystery where those goods had disappeared to. However, the Super Squad Guild was powerful enough that its members could get away with it. The counselors didn't have that privilege. Charles had been explicit that they would be transporting his private goods, adding extra weight to their need to make sure that everything arrived at its destination in one piece. If anything went missing, it would come out of their own pockets, and on their return, they would surely face Charles's wrath. If they were successful, though, they would be able to divide the profits equally, and even overlooking Charles's threats, resources hadn't yet become quite so scarce that they would actually be tempted to take the goods for themselves. After they had left, Charles glanced at his watch, and then he reminded himself of the date. It had been almost 6 months since the apocalypse had begun. 5 days had passed since he had returned from hell. It had been a week of hard work and bloody fighting. Olivia suddenly remembered something. Christopher brought us a map yesterday, she said. She took out the map from her bag and handed it to Charles. Then she pointed at a specific spot on it. He's marked the point where the barrier between worlds is at its weakest. Do you think we can trust him? Although she still had doubts about Christopher, Charles had a lot of faith in the explorer, and so Olivia was resigned to allocating a portion of her funds to his endeavors. He was set on studying the fabric of the nearby space and locating its weakest point, which was where he was convinced another species would soon try to launch an invasion. Using his soul energy, Charles made a copy of the map and placed it in the energy storage space. I have no doubts about its reliability, he said. Even if it's inaccurate, I'd put it down to the strange weather we've been having, a result of the unusual flow of soul energy. Even so, it's still useful. Then he thought of something. Didn't Christopher say he'd seen a heavy storm at the end of last month and warned people not to go out? Surely that's proof that at least some of his predictions are correct. Most people ignored him and went at it anyway, said Olivia. Still, it boosted our sale of raincoats. Charles smiled at her joke, despite his best efforts. When she left, he spent some time comparing the map with what he knew of the future, and spotted some areas where the lime lines had diverged. In each case, it was unclear if it was an error of Christopher's judgment, or if the invaders had simply changed the location where they would invade. It reminded Charles that even though he had some knowledge of the future, he couldn't rely on it for making his plans in his new life. He needed to be prepared to change his plans based on new information. Also, he knew that some species were strong enough that they might not even worry about using the weakest point to invade. If they were sufficiently powerful, they might instead invade where they could make the greatest gains. This is my home, he thought, surveying the terrain of the map. This is where my family lives. No matter what happens, I'll protect it until my last breath. With the safety of his family on the line, he would do all he could to defend against dangers from the human world, or any other. He needed a few days to prepare both the supplies that would be delivered to the Midwest and the people who would take them. He understood that they too would need to make arrangements before leaving. The Super Squad Guild used the time to train. Although there still weren't that many people who had joined the guild, the number was large enough to take on the zombies and mutated animals that might attack the trading party. More than 10,000 guild members lived in various survival bases, and they had established different factions. It was vital to keep communication open between them so that the Super Squad members didn't abandon their positions. With so many leaving Dawn City with the trading party, they needed to entice some members from the other factions to defend Dawn City in their absence. Olivia promised them bountiful resources and payment, which swayed enough of them that they could be confident the city would be well defended. One of her promises was that they would be able to keep 20% of any resources they found, which would allow them to buy many high-quality weapons. Before long, droves of Super Squad mercenaries were lining up to join Dawn City. Before long, Dawn City had become the center of the entire eastern region. Those who remained behind in the other bases resented Dawn City's success, but they could do nothing to oppose them. At the end of the day, Olivia hadn't outright lied to anyone. It was just that Dawn City was powerful enough that it could deliver on its promises. The only way to go against Dawn City would be to destroy it completely, which was impossible. Whether in the time before the apocalypse or during it, there were few who were able to live entirely self-sufficiently. They might be able to stockpile supplies, but before long, they would need to venture out to buy or gather more. It was the same for the survival bases, which would need to trade and cooperate with one another to have any long-term chances of enduring. Many of the bases had started to develop their own businesses. Agriculture and weapons manufacture were the most profitable, although Dawn City had an almost total monopoly over the production of weapons. The benefits of owning powerful weapons were self-evident. The right weapon could give a lower-level warrior the chance to hold their own in a battle against a higher-level one. Dawn City's control of the market lay in the quality of the weapons it produced. Many people have been able to buy weapons at level 3 in their home survival bases, but Dawn City's weapons were at level 4 or even higher. The most basic weapons forged from dark iron were still at the highest stage of level 5, while even the apprentice dark dwarves were able to forge powerful level 6 weapons. At its highest potential, dark iron could even be used to craft level 7 weapons. However, at that stage, the deadliness of the weapon didn't improve much as it advanced through the levels. Instead, the higher level weapons were simply more durable. In a sense, the production of level 6 weapons was more beneficial than level 7 ones. In the time it took to forge a level 7 weapon, the dwarves could instead make more than 20 at level 6. For those reasons, Charles asked most of them to focus on forging level 6 weapons or armor, while only a few elite smiths worked on level 7 equipment. The dwarves' efficiency had increased greatly after Charles had sent many recent captives to the energy storage space, which they were able to use as labor. They put those creatures to the menial task of crushing and refining ore, while the dwarves themselves focused on more skilled forging processes. As a result, Charles had essentially turned the storage space into a large-scale factory, where the sheer volume of equipment being made was more important than the quality of each individual piece. It had gotten to the stage, for example, where each dwarf could forge more than 30 swords a day, with all the dwarves together creating tens of thousands per day. They were also able to produce ample sets of armor, for which there was a much lower demand than there was for weapons. They were easily able to make enough for the Super Squad factions, which numbered fewer than 200. In fact, they were able to produce enough sets to last each faction a week with just a day's work. After recognizing the importance of adverse conditions for growing hardy crops in the storage space, Charles would periodically summon heavy rains, fierce gales, and sporadic lightning to speed along his agricultural output. Although he initially needed to summon each weather pattern himself, he'd recently noticed that they had begun to happen of their own accord. As a result, the crops grew hardier and more plentiful, to the point that Charles was able to estimate a yield almost double that of the previous year. The majority of the tree ants that had grown in the energy storage space's waste dump had died, with fewer than 200 saplings surviving. Charles had also planted some of their seeds in various areas with water shortages, with high temperatures, with low temperatures, and other extreme conditions. Many of the specimens had survived, which wasn't too surprising, considering that they had managed to survive in the harsh environment of hell. He had also begun to cultivate some mutated plants in the storage space. He planted them in milder environments, planning to wait until they had grown older and fruited before adjusting their climate by any great extent. Since they were new plants unique to the apocalyptic era, he was keen to study them in detail rather than risk destroying them with extreme conditions. After planting another batch of saplings, he left the storage space. Olivia came to his side and presented him with some statistics on the condition of pregnant women across the survival bases, many of whom had fallen victim to infection and mutation. Such reports had led to general anxiety around reproducing in general. Charles was dejected to hear it, even though he knew that such a situation was unavoidable. Since the beginning of the apocalypse, certain health risks had become particularly widespread. For instance, although the air wasn't dangerous, the water was, and only paranormals at level 3 or above could safely drink untreated water. Fortunately, Dawn City had been able to distribute water-repelling pearls, which could be used to cleanse the water. "Our resources are limited," said Charles. "The supplies we do have, we need to prioritize sending them to soldiers and their families. The higher their rank and the greater their contribution on the battlefield, the more they should be given." He had learned that he wasn't able to save everybody, and so they needed to distribute in some kind of order of priority. At the top were those who fought for him. Next were families with children or pregnant women, and then those who had followed him since the beginning. In his previous life, he had made the mistake of trying to save too many people, which had resulted in losing many who were close to him. That approach had also alienated his loved ones, who had felt less valued because they had been given the same treatment as everybody else. Many had ended up betraying or abandoning him. He knew that he couldn't afford to make the same mistake in his new life, so he demanded that if people wanted better treatment, they needed to work for it. "That's not all," said Olivia. "We found nuclear radiation in the nearby river. In fact, all the nearby water sources are polluted with it. Our standard water purification methods can't purify radiation, so we're relying on our own resistance to withstand it. It's okay for adults at high enough levels, but if any newborns or children drink the water, it'll be a disaster." Her meaning was clear. If nothing was done about the nuclear radiation, the children would die, and then people would stop wanting to have children at all. The entire population was at risk. Charles considered that for a moment. "We'll discuss this later," he said. "That's a problem for the future. We need to stabilize the current situation first." From his understanding of future events, he knew that if the water sources had been polluted by nuclear radiation, it wouldn't be long before the invasion of the beasts. Although managing the various situations across Dawn City was hardly the most exciting of tasks, it had given Charles respite, a chance to decompress, so that he was able to launch into the next step of his plan with renewed energy. However, before he left the meeting room, a woman entered. He didn't recognize her, but her angry glare suggested that she knew him. "Ah, Chloe," said Olivia. "Did you do what I asked?" "Yes," Chloe replied, brushing past Charles. Charles recognized her name. Chloe Delpy was one of the key figures calling for the women of Dawn City to break apart from the men and create their own independent faction. Charles wondered at her relationship with Olivia, suspecting that she was using Olivia's power in the city for her own ends. Olivia didn't seem to notice any tension between Chloe and Charles. Instead, she simply looked up at Charles, who was still standing in the doorway. "Do you have any other business?" she asked him. "No," he replied. "No more business." And with that, he left the room. "I see you two are pretty close," Chloe said once he was out of earshot. She had a lot of respect for Olivia and assumed that the reason she spent so much time with Charles was so that she could take advantage of him somehow. She understood that as things stood, with Charles holding the greatest authority in the city, there wasn't much choice other than to cozy up to him. Olivia shrugged. "I don't have feelings for him, if that's what you mean," she said. "But he has a lot of power and can protect those close to him, and so I choose to be close to him." Growing up, she'd been accustomed to her parents using her as nothing more than a bargaining chip in their various disagreements, and had since found it easier to approach relationships strictly in terms of their benefits and costs. She'd abandoned her parents at the first opportunity, leaving Miranda as the only person she trusted completely. "I'll change your mind about that one of these days," said Chloe through gritted teeth. "You won't achieve your aims only by distancing yourself from those you don't agree with," said Olivia. "I'd like to help you, but if you're rejecting the current status quo, you need to show your followers what your alternative will be." Her bluntness sent a chill down Chloe's spine. "I understand," she said. "I'll keep that in mind. When the time comes, I promise you'll see me differently." Once she had left, Olivia shook her head. She sympathized with Chloe's mission and agreed that the women in the city shouldn't rely on the men. In fact, if she had it her way, she would rely on nobody but herself. But at that point, they were doing all they could just to live to see another day, and that was all she felt they could expect for the time being. The news had spread that Dawn City was recruiting scouts, and many people had signed up. Among them were the 6 paladins and all the captains. The general opinion was that it would be foolish to pass up the chance for better treatment and rewards, especially as they were already in positions that required them to put their lives on the line. In addition to the material benefits, scouts were given a much higher level of autonomy and independence than other soldiers. For one, they didn't need to worry about receiving credit for their performance in battle. They would also receive a substantial salary. As a result, it was a very attractive prospect for many. If it weren't for the fact that applications were only open to the captains and those of a higher rank, many others would have joined up. In total, 400 applied. They were delighted by the prospect of promotion, but their hopes fell as soon as they heard about their first test. In groups of 6, they had 3 days to capture 1,000 living creatures of level 3 or above. They could be animals or zombies. The crucial point was that they needed to be delivered alive. Although the applicants were permitted to include insects and rodents in their count, they would earn a lower score if they only brought a small number of species. After reading the conditions, half of the prospective scouts withdrew their applications. "Forget capturing them. We can't even kill 1,000 animals or zombies in 3 days," one complained. "Is the mayor playing some joke on us?" asked another. "Is this his way of telling us he doesn't want any scouts after all?" "This is a very serious mission," said one of the commanders in charge of recruitment. "Within 3 days, we want 1,000 living creatures from each group. Not only do we need to capture them, but we also need to keep them alive," said one of the protesters. "How can 6 people manage that?" "Well, I suggest starting as soon as possible," said the commander. Those who had recently been so eager to join the scouts withdrew one by one. They thought that the conditions of the test were too difficult, and attempting it would only be a waste of time. In the end, only around 200 applicants remained. "You can see why Charles has set these rules, right?" Quentin asked Joshua. Joshua nodded. "He's making the point that our strength won't solve everything," he said. "It doesn't matter if we're paranormals or martial artists. If we can't work together, there's a real limit to what we can achieve. We also need to make sure there are people on our team who are familiar with the wild. If they were going to have any chance of success, they would need to study the monster guidebook that the Super Squad Guild had distributed. Not only did it describe the characteristics of various monsters, but it also explained how such creatures survived. Although some people were too lazy to read through it, others realized how useful it would be. Although the knowledge wouldn't directly increase their strength, a better understanding of the wild and the creatures in it would both increase their survivability and give them guidance on how to keep any captured creatures alive.